It's right here. Is that it? Am I looking into it? So we're just gonna go over Amanda Gorman's poetry. We're gonna go over it kind of line by line and see what is it all about.
When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast.
So in the first 4 lines, we have at least 3 things. We have the light bringing about a question. We have Jonah we have a reference to Jonah chapter 1 verse 17, and we therefore have this comparison between the U.S. and Nineveh, which brings about even more questions to whether the U.S. has gone astray, whether we need to get back to God, how do we get back to God, who is Jonah in this example, and we could ask a bunch of questions like that.
We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always just is. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished.
These 10 lines between 5 and 14, I think, are a great introduction into what the entire poem is going to be. So we have this comparison between quiet silence and peace. And she says that sometimes it does equal peace and sometimes it doesn't. And so we can ask ourselves, when does quiet silence equal peace? Well, we can think about peaceful protest, maybe that would be easier. But when does quiet silence doesn't equal peace? Well, we have words for that, and some words for that would be like complacence, cowardice, or lack of knowledge. In those cases, we're quiet and we don't speak out about anything, or we're afraid, and so we don't speak up for each other. We have these play on words with the justice, just ice, but Amanda's very particular. She doesn't really say it's all bad. She says it's sometimes used. What's the word? She says isn't always. That's the word she uses. Isn't always. She says just isn't always justice, just ice, which means that it sometimes is. So we have this idea that justice serves the norm. Justice doesn't serve the smaller blue circle, which would be like the minority, whatever you want to call that. And then conditionally, just ice, so the force of ice, this military power, this military force, the universal impacting the individual, sometimes that's necessary, but it isn't always. Very moderate view, very balanced. She's a very virtuous and keen thinker, I would argue. Whatever it is, she sees the state as an unfinished project, the country as unfinished. She's not going for an idealism. She's not going for a nihilism that's saying it's absolutely meaningless, the purpose of the state, the government is useless. No, she's saying, well, eventually we'll get there. I find that as a very balanced view. I like it.
We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one. And yes, we are far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean we are striving to form a union that is perfect. We are striving to forge our union with purpose.
So the next 10 lines, 15 to 24, we have this dynamic between the country and time. We have at least 3 other things after that, which is an autobiography, how she views herself, how she views us in between 2 extremes, and then presuppositions of our wills. So the autobiography goes from enslavement to a single mother to herself as Amanda residing over the vice presidency, hoping to become president. And then she places us, we, the country, in between two extremes of being polished and pristine and the other one being impure and broken. Then finally, I believe that she's expressing that the perfect purpose exists before striving, that we strive for the perfect purpose to begin with.
To compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another.
So lines 25 to 33 begin with alliteration of characteristics of the state emanating from it, which would be characters, cultures, conditions, and colors, which is a reference to the state's diversity. We then have a double meaning of words of between us and before us, which can both exist physically and temporally. So she tells us not to focus on the division between us. So the division between us physically could be like physical space, or even things that we do in order to go against each other. And then a temporal between us would be an era, I would suspect, or a generation, or a certain zeitgeist that belongs to a different time. And then what does she tell us to gaze upon? Well, she tells us to gaze upon the past, to gaze what's before us in the past. In some way, we're going to allocate the past and use it in our immediate present, and then eventually use it in the future and fulfill it. So she sets up this dynamic of being judged both by the future and the past. And another way to convey this is an idea from Frankl, which is the hourglass, where the future exists and compresses into the present, and the past also compresses into the present.
We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. That even as we grieved, we grew. That even as we hurt, we hoped. That even as we tired, we tried. That we'll forever be tied together, victorious. Not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division.
Lines 34 to 41 have two allusions and expression of overcoming with alliteration, and an understanding of how defeat is woven into victory. To begin with the allusion, we seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. I feel like this is a reference to Luke chapter 2, verse 14, and that peace, similar to that verse, is existing on an individual, communal, and ecological level. So there's peace within individuals and themselves, there's peace between people, and there's peace for the earth itself. Next, we have this dynamic of overcoming, of grieved, grew, hurt, hoped, tired, tried. So that also shows you that defeat is a part of this victory. Finally, we have this acceptance that we're victorious not because we ever knew defeat, but because we never sowed division. And so the next idea of sowing division comes from Matthew chapter 34, verses 24 to 43, that involve the Son of Man spreading his seed and the weed growing around that seed, and then asking whether we should deracinate the bad seed from the good seed. And then Jesus famously says, wait until harvest, and then harvest is the end of the age. And then the harvesters, which are the angels, are going to separate that and distinguish them. But the point is that God decides who to judge. It's not for us to go against my fellow man if I think that he's doing wrong and destroy him. And in fact, when we end up doing that, we end up sabotaging ourselves. And so that's kind of how I have this image of God stopping this idealistic defeat of the enemy, Yet when the individual strives for this idealistic defeat of the enemy, it undermines their purpose of victory, and they sabotage themselves. So this would be similar to any coup that seeks an idealistic end, but then eventually goes against itself. I think all human endeavors kind of show this in a way.
Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid.
Next, we have lines of 42 to 44. It's directly mentioning that there's a scripture here. The scripture reference is Micah chapter 4, verse 4. You can see the progression of the verses here. Finally, when we get to verse 43, it says that everyone shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, which is in direct reference to Micah chapter 4, verse 4, which says everyone will sit under their own vine, under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. And the Lord Almighty has spoken.
If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. That is the promised glade, the hill we climb, if only we dare it, because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it.
Lines 45 to 52 have the title of the poem expressed in a metaphor. It also has another allusion that I just realized. So we have first this understanding that victory doesn't exist in the blade. So modern victory does not equal blade, but modern victory actually equals a bridge, bridges, communication between people. It's a beautiful metaphor. But it's also an allusion to Matthew chapter 26, verse 52. This idea, this Christian belief that, those who live by the sword perish from it. And so it's, again, this self-defeating idealism that's within the blade that we previously mentioned wasn't the right way of going about the world, which the previous allusions went against. Finally, we get to the hill we climb, the name of the piece, and we now understand the hill is composed of the past, that we walk upon the past, in the present, into the future, but yet it's not only this victory walk, it's also a walk upon the past.
We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. And this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith we trust, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us.
Lines 51 to 60 begin with force. Force can be interpreted as aspects of our immediate past, such as the Capitol Hill riot, as well as other aspects of American history, such as slavery and prejudice. In each one of these, there's a characteristic of covetous. So what was coveted in the Capitol Hill riot was the election and the presidency. What was coveted during slavery was property to such an extent that it was willing to make other individuals property. And then prejudice is similar to that, where individuals covet other people's inalienable rights. Next, we have this understanding of democracy, which is unstoppable. And the reason why I say that is because she says that all these forces were simply delaying democracy. Finally, we have an understanding of time, which is similar to what we heard of before in lines 27 to 29. So lines 27 to 29 spoke about not gazing at what stood between us, but rather looking at what stood before us, and what stood before us means both what stands in front of us as well as our past. And from the past, we're going to be able to make a plan for the future. Lines 59 to 60 capitalize upon that, and they say, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. So in that sense, the future uses us as a reference, and the past has the expectation for us on what to become.
This is the era of just redemption. We feared it at its inception. We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour, but within it we found the power to author a new chapter, to offer hope and laughter to ourselves. So, while once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert.
Lines 61 to 70 begins with just redemption. And just redemption, similar to the last 10 lines, I believe relates to the Capitol Hill riot. It could also relate to the continuation of democracy, as well as ending prejudice. Next, we have the use of consonants in the words hour, power, chapter, and laughter. So we have a terrifying hour, the power, new chapter, and laughter. Next, we have the reversal of a few words in lines 68 and 69, where it says, we possibly prevail catastrophe, which is an expression of despair. How could we prevail? And then the reversal of that is catastrophe possibly prevail us. And then there's a double meaning on us, which could also mean the U.S., which is an expression of hope, which is a similar reference to what was previous in the poem about grieved and grew, hurt, hoped, and so forth.
How could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be, a country that is bruised but whole.
Lines 72 to 74 are talking about time. So what was is the past, what shall be is the future. This is consistent with lines 27 to 29, as well as lines 59 to 60. It's again expressing that we're moving, the future is judging the present, the past is judging the present as well. We also have this phrase in line 74, bruised but whole. And in a way, the bruise itself it's distinguished from the whole. Nevertheless, this is again incorporating defeat into victory, as we saw previously already.
Whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation.
Line 75 to 80 begins with alliteration and assonance. So we have benevolent and bold. Bold is rhyming with the vowel sound within whole from the previous line. And we have alliteration with benevolent and bold, fierce and free. We should also compare this to lines 36 and 38, which have a downward trajectory followed by an upward trajectory, compared to lines 75 to 76, which all seem to be positive and exponential. Finally, we have an understanding of time, which has been previously expressed, which is that inaction and inertia leads to inheritance. And inheritance of what? Well, something bad for the future generation. Who's judging us? The future is judging us.
Our blunders become their burdens, but one thing is certain. If we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left, with every breath from my bronze-pounded chest.
Lines 81 to 89 are going to go over stuff that we already mentioned. So I just want to point out the alliteration with blunders become burdens, merge mercy might, the consonants with might and right at the end, the rhyming at the end, and then alliteration again with breath, bronze, pounded chest. The idea here is similar to what we already mentioned. So our blunders become a burden of the future. That's the future judging us.
We will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the gold-limbed hills of the west. We will rise from the wind-swept northeast where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked south. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover in every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country. Our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful when they...
Lines 90 to 100 are very good because of their alliteration and repetition. Yet lines 99 to 100 are very profound because of their juxtaposition and seeming contradiction of each other. So I just want to go over the alliteration to begin with and repetition. So she says, rise 4 times, realize revolution, rimmed, rebuild, reconcile, recover. We 6 times, will 7 times. Wounded world wondrous, west windswept, no nook nation, corner called country. And she ends, and I'm going to read it, lines 99 to 100, which say, our people diverse and beautiful will emerge battered and beautiful. And so this is a contradiction because a people or a homogenized group is different from diversity. And yet somehow they're able to fuse together and emerge into something. But yet when they emerge, there's still a contradiction of each other. It's both battered and beautiful. It's not battered in the cuisine sense. It's battered in the wounded sense. And I would defend my view by saying that in line 90, she states that it's a wounded world. And furthermore, we know that in her interpretation of victory, it incorporates defeat.
Day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
The ending of the poem, lines 101 to 106, end with what the day is. So the day is light, the darkness were the problems, then we come to realize the solutions. And the day, it's like a metaphor for problem solving. We have repetition with free it, see it, and be it. Also with consonants with the ending vowel sound for each word. Finally, we have virtue, which is bravery, as a middle point between 2 extremes, one extreme of ruthlessness and then the other extreme of cowardice. And in some way, we need bravery in order to see the light and find the solutions in the world. And that way, kind of the Christian rational tradition kind of unites itself with the gospel and with things like Plato's allegory of the cave. So that's it. I really like Amanda Gorman's poem, and that's all I had to say about this. I hope other people had their own interpretations as well.